felt a cleaving in my mind, as if my brain had split. I tried to match it seam by seam, but could not make them fit. The thought behind I strove to join unto the thought before, but sequence raveled out of sound, like balls upon a floor. The teenage brain. By the second decade of life, the human brain is full size. It's billions of neurons all in place. But it is not yet finished.
The brain is a work in progress, and adolescence is the last great time of enormous brain change and brain development.
Now the drama of brain development focuses on the part of the brain that makes us uniquely human, the still maturing prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex is a part of the brain that allows us to make future plans, and that's involved in such highly abstract areas as personal responsibility, morality, and self-control. This part of the brain is undergoing this major step in maturation during adolescence.
With the part of the brain responsible for reason, judgment, and self-discipline still developing, it is no wonder that the teenage years can be a time of turmoil and confusion.
The adolescent's brain is clumsy because all of a sudden there's these new parts of their brain that are online that are doing tasks and they're getting used to it. They are trying to figure out, okay, I've got a frontal cortex, what do I do with it?
The developing teenage brain is in flux, shaping personality, behavior, even identity itself. As the brain matures, the teenager also faces special risks, from addictive drugs and alcohol that can hijack the brain to the chaos of schizophrenia that strikes most often during adolescence. Sometimes the teenage brain fails in ways that challenge even our most advanced understanding of how it works. 2 years ago, Courtney Hale Cook was a senior in high school when he was struck by schizophrenia, a brain disease to which adolescents are particularly vulnerable.
You know, I spent, up to that point, I had spent 19 years, with virtually the same personality. And I was very accustomed to it, and I liked it. I liked being me, And all of a sudden it was taken away.
He would come up to me and he would say, "Mom, you look like a really old lady today." And he said, he would point to my eyes and he'd say, "You have a black hole here and a black hole there." Or he would describe things as going into tunnel vision so that everything else is black except what was in that small tunnel at the end. When he would open his eyes in the morning, he would see gnats, he would see sparkles, not even with the first thought of the day, just the minute the eyes were open, he would have all these visual disturbances.
They're usually in the very center of my vision. But it varies. Like now, they're kind of just wherever I see the sky. They're still there.
I think it took him a number of weeks to come to me and say, "Mom, I've seen this in psych class, and Mom, I'm really terrified. I'm really scared that I have schizophrenia."
I felt like I was going crazy. And, I felt like I'm going to be crazy for the rest of my life.
It's hard for me to imagine a disease that is crueler than schizophrenia. I mean, when does it begin? You know, in late adolescence and early 20s, just when a family and society have their maximal investment in a young person, just when, you know, they're about to graduate high school or college. And this child is lost in the most awful way.
At the University of Iowa, Courtney is part of a research study that is investigating how schizophrenic brains function and malfunction.
We'll put the bonnet on.
Schizophrenia is as complex as the brain itself, and clues to its biology have been stubbornly elusive.
Schizophrenia is definitely an enigma. It's never been possible to identify an obvious disease-related feature that distinguishes schizophrenia from all other conditions. You look at a brain of a patient with schizophrenia under a microscope, you don't see anything that would make you say, aha, this is a disorder of these cells or those cells.
What has gone wrong inside the brain of someone suffering from schizophrenia? For centuries, the answer has eluded researchers. But new imaging technologies have revealed how the brain fails to function properly. Focusing attention on several different brain regions that are underperforming. Regions responsible for thinking and reasoning, memory, and emotion. The fact that so many regions are malfunctioning has led researchers to investigate a part of the brain which coordinates their operation, the prefrontal cortex.
There's certainly a lot of evidence that the prefrontal cortex functions like the conductor in an orchestra, and that it maintains harmony and it makes music out of many, many disparate elements of this orchestration. And that we think that part of the problem when the frontal cortex is deficient, as it may be in schizophrenia, is that instead of music, there's noise.
One of the things that happened to me was that I was constantly like stupefied, and I do have a little bit of trouble staying coherent, staying to one particular subject, you know, because my mind is somewhere else.
This time I want you to tell me the color of the ink. Ignore what the word says and tell me the ink. Red, blue, brown. Okay?
All right.
As quickly as you can. Ready? Go.
Red, blue, brown, red, green, blue, brown, brown.
A poorly functioning
blue,
prefrontal
red,
cortex
blue, red,
makes
green,
thinking difficult.
brown, blue,
It is no surprise that many people with schizophrenia don't perform well on a series of tests designed to measure their ability to think and reason clearly.
red, blue.
Courtney was once a good student, but as the disease progressed, his grades began to drop, and he finally had to put off plans for college.
Schizophrenia is a disease that affects the highest human functions, the parts of us that are most evolutionarily advanced, our ability to think at high conceptual levels.
Scientists had once hoped that MRI images of the brain would help solve the mysteries of schizophrenia by identifying damage to specific brain structures. Instead, the images revealed a new mystery.
We were surprised to see that there was no obvious hole in the head. But what there was that the ventricles of the brain, which are these centers in the brain that have spinal fluid, water in them, that are just cavities, were slightly bigger in patients with schizophrenia.
Why were the ventricles, reservoirs of fluid that cushion the brain's delicate tissue, larger in schizophrenia? The oversized ventricles proved to be evidence that other areas of the brain were smaller.
Your skull is made of hard bones that does not expand. So if the ventricles, these cavities, got bigger, the only way all this could stay inside your skull was that something else had to get smaller. And there have been a lot of studies subsequently showing that there is a slight, very slight, thinning of the surface of the brain, the cortex, probably that accounts for these changes in the ventricles.
Once again, evidence pointed to a connection between damage in the prefrontal cortex and schizophrenia, which may help explain why the disease appears most often during adolescence.
How can I trust you when I know what you've done?
Baby, please believe that all that is done.
If I decide to go along,
I promise I won't do you wrong.
are you sure?
Researchers are now looking more closely at developments in the normal adolescent brain for clues to what might trigger the onset of schizophrenia.
The adolescent brain is far more flexible, far more adaptable than we had ever realized before. There's enormous potential for change, and not just change in sort of psychological dimensions, but actual physical, anatomical changes.
At the beginning of adolescence, the prefrontal cortex goes through a burst of growth as neurons reach out to connect to other neurons, much as they do throughout the brain during early childhood. And just as in children, the connections between neurons in the teenage brain grow stronger, or they are pruned back and wither away.
Sort of nature's way of making sure that the connections that do survive are hardy and robust. One of the ways the brain seems to try to figure out which connections to keep and which ones to eliminate or prune is based on the activities of the teen. The brain is searching for, what am I going to need to be good at to survive in this environment? And the way that it figures that out is, what am I doing now?
Adolescence could be characterized as a stressful time for the brain. There are chemical changes, hormonal changes, anatomical changes, changes in the expression of genes inside of cells. It's a time of great biological tumult. And the frontal lobe is fighting to adapt to the environment, to deal with all these inner instinctual surges. It's difficult. It's difficult with a frontal lobe that's normal to make it through adolescence. But we believe that patients with schizophrenia don't have a frontal lobe that's normal. We believe it didn't develop normally, probably from early in life.
Are there clues to schizophrenia in childhood that may explain the brain's later failure during adolescence? Can the child's brain be hiding within it the seeds of its own later malfunction? Psychologist Elaine Walker is trying to answer those questions by examining the home movies of children who later developed schizophrenia.
We were looking for evidence that there was some abnormality in brain function. And of course, one of the best places to look for that in young children is in their motor development. This child only uses one hand to try to catch the ball. This child is showing some unusual posturing of his left hand, hyperextension of his fingers. Normal children develop crawling in a symmetric fashion. This is a very asymmetric crawling pattern, and that is another characteristic that we observed more often in the children who later developed schizophrenia.
Walker's observations cannot be used to predict schizophrenia. Although these eccentric movements appear more frequently in children who eventually develop the disease, they can be found in normal children as well. But Walker's study is consistent with the theory that schizophrenia is caused by events in early brain development, even, perhaps, just months after conception. As neurons are born, take their place in the developing brain, and then join one another in an intricate network of connections, scientists see the possibility for error. The genetic makeup of the brain itself, poor nutrition during pregnancy, or a viral infection, all may have devastating effects. Whatever the cause, scientists speculate the damage lies dormant until adolescence, when the prefrontal cortex goes through its final maturation.
Schizophrenia could be a disease in which this last developmental stage is run amok, and we end up literally with the wrong connections in the brain.
Courtney, we're going to bring a monitor over in front of you that you'll be viewing throughout the study.
Okay.
Schizophrenia disrupts not only the thinking parts of the brain, but it can also have a severe impact on the emotions.
Courtney, next you'll be viewing some slides that most people find to be pleasant or positive in content. Just relax and watch.
To probe the emotional regions of the brain, researchers flash a series of pictures on a screen and use advanced imaging technologies to watch the brain's response. The normal brain responds to these stimulating images by activating regions of the brain that process emotions. These same regions respond poorly in many people with schizophrenia.
People with schizophrenia will very often say, I've lost the capacity to feel related to other people in the world, or even related to the world at all. It's both an intellectual emptiness and an emotional emptiness. And it's one of the factors that drives people with schizophrenia to feel like taking their lives, to feel like committing suicide, because they feel as if they've lost themselves.
The thing that really crushed me was the lack of motivation, the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, the flat affect, the emotionlessness, the apathy. Those were the things that really got to me.
He would talk frequently about not being able to feel anything. He could feel no sorrow. He could feel no joy. There was just nothing there. No sorrow, just empty. That's what he would describe, just empty and black.
I didn't want to live the life that I'd been given anymore. It was so contrary to what I wanted that I didn't want it anymore.
When I heard that Courtney had attempted suicide, I was not surprised. He had talked about it, he has had ideas about suicide, and he's one of those individuals that understands he has an illness and it's not likely to go away. That he hadn't succeeded was perhaps what surprised me the most, because he succeeds in most things that he's done in life up to this schizophrenia.
I wrote in my suicide note that why take death seriously if the quality of life is poor? And that thought really stuck with me for a long time.
While schizophrenia has stolen Courtney's emotional life, other teenagers with schizophrenia suffer from hallucinations as well, frightening visions and voices that do not exist.
June 17, 2000. Dear Diary, it's been strange. It wasn't a good day. I'm so depressed, I hate myself. Things would be better if, well, you know, gotta go now. Love, Sabrina Yeskel.
Sabrina Yeskel was an excited 12-year-old when she first went off to sleepaway camp. Once there, she began to hear voices.
They were loud. The tone of voice was a deep, heavy-set voice. They've said to kill yourself. They've said, I'm not worth living.
Sabrina's mother rushed to camp, but barely recognized her daughter.
She started screaming, stop. And I said, what, Sabrina? What's going on? She said, he's trying to kill me. So I pulled off the road, tried to hold her and tell her everything was okay. We made it home, but she came in the house screaming. The man was following her everywhere, and he was still trying to choke her.
Sabrina was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now 14, she has been struggling for 2 years to stay in touch with reality. She still hears threatening voices, and hallucinations haunt her waking hours.
Sabrina often sees a black hooded dressed figure that sometimes will just stare at her, sometimes it talks to her, sometimes it tries to touch her, sometimes it tries to kill her. Sometimes when she's struggling with this, they begin almost chanting, "Kill yourself, do it, do it, do it."
Come on in.
All right.
Have a seat.
At the University of North Carolina, researchers are investigating how hallucinations can overwhelm the adolescent brain, and they are testing new drugs to help treat these psychotic symptoms.
Could you look right at that keyhole over there? I'm going to check your eyes out, if that's okay. You just look
Isaac
straight
Wallace
ahead.
began to hear voices when he first went off to college. As the voices grew more frightening and his thoughts more paranoid, he was finally hospitalized for his own protection.
When Isaac walked in the hospital, he was completely wrapped up in hallucinatory experiences he was having, the voices he was hearing, the beliefs he had developed to explain the voices.
Whenever I'd hear voices, I just completely block out what was in the real world and just think about what the voices were saying and talk to them.
The voices that Isaac heard were disturbing because they appeared so real. Yet they were produced by his own flawed brain.
When you see psychosis, you realize that we don't hear with our ears. We hear with our brain. We don't see with our eyes. We see with our brain. And so when the brain misfires, you can have experiences of hearing voices that sound just like they're coming from outside your head.
In the normal brain, waves of sound falling on the ear travel as electrical and chemical pulses to the hearing part of the brain, the auditory cortex, generating a surge of signals that travel to the thinking regions of the brain where they are interpreted. Scientists believe that in psychosis, the thinking regions fail. Neurons misfire in random and chaotic ways, creating sounds that have no connection to the outside world. The result? A perception of sounds that do not exist.
So when the brain misfires, when the circuitry in your brain is out of whack, it'll be just as if you're hearing the radio on.
Scientists theorize that psychosis is caused in part by problems with a chemical in the brain called dopamine, one of the brain's neurotransmitters, molecules that send messages from cell to cell across a tiny gap, the synapse. In the normal brain, dopamine acts by stimulating receptors on the neuron that is its target, setting off a cascade of electrical and chemical reactions. In the psychotic brain, for reasons that scientists are still trying to understand, the levels of dopamine surge, overstimulating the receptors, wreaking havoc with the brain's ability to send clear and accurate signals. Since the 1950s, antipsychotic medications have been standard treatment for relieving psychosis. For Isaac, they have worked wonders.
I'd say within 3 weeks, the voices really, they dropped maybe in half to maybe 75% less than what I was hearing. Yeah, it has brought me out of, my own little world and, brought me back into reality. I can hold a job now, and I think I can go back to school as well because my memory's back and my concentration is back. I think I might do better than I did before.
Antipsychotic medications relieve psychosis by reducing the impact of dopamine on the neuron by clogging dopamine-sensitive receptors. With diminished neuronal stimulation, psychotic symptoms lessen and often disappear.
We were lucky. We found the right medicine for Isaac. And at this point, I think he's had a almost complete recovery. He's back to his old self, his old Isaac.
Antipsychotic medications don't cure schizophrenia, and Isaac will need to take them for the rest of his life. But in some people, the drugs don't work at all. Schizophrenia varies from person to person, and Sabrina has a more resistant form of the disease.
When Sabrina first became seriously sick 2 years ago, it seemed like we had 100 possible medicines to try, and certainly one of them would work. And yet, we discover that they haven't worked, and it's getting very scary because we don't have many left. And as a parent, it's incredibly difficult to watch your child suffer. But it's also, I see her courage, I really do. I see her fighting this every day, and I'm incredibly proud of her.
I'll remember it later. That's who taught me. It was my dad, and it was...
For Courtney, medications have helped him pull back from the emotional void he once faced. His thoughts of suicide have passed. He still struggles with his illness, but he is going on with his life and has recently entered college.
I'd rather have lived the life that I live right now, as confusing and painful as it has been, than to have never been born at all.
I think he has learned a lot about how fragile life is. I think he has learned a lot about what is really important.
Every year, 300,000 Americans are diagnosed with schizophrenia. Most of them first develop symptoms in their late teens. But millions more teenagers are vulnerable to another danger.